Felicia Thelwell needed a quiet moment to breathe, because if her family's finances slipped any further, her mother would force her into the arms of 43-year-old Algernon Jenkins. The thought alone made her chest tighten. The air was still thick and sweetly damp from the afternoon's sudden downpour, but the sun had broken through the clouds, a perfect, fragile light illuminating the narrow country path. Felicia Thelwell, 22 years old and acutely aware of her family's precarious financial position, pulled her best Sunday muslin a little closer, careful to avoid the water pooling in the wheel ruts. Her sanctuary was a worn wooden bench nestled beside the river. Here, surrounded by the cool, comforting green of the country, she could finally escape the breathless anxiety of her mother, Lydia Thelwell. Lydia's primary, and certainly loudest, goal was to see her daughter quickly married to wealth, primarily the wealth of the tedious 43-year-old Algernon Jenkins. Felicia opened her worn copy of Shakespeare, seeking refuge in the noble, tragic language. Her own troubles, though immediate and humiliating, seemed less pressing when measured against the fate of kings and star-crossed lovers. A heavy vibration traveled through the earth, interrupting her focus. It was the unmistakable rumble of a large, expensive travel carriage approaching the bend, a vehicle of immense power, rarely seen on this quiet lane. Felicia instinctively flattened herself against the hedge, but it was too late. The carriage, heavy and imposing, crested the rise. It moved with the reckless speed of a man for whom inconvenience was an unknown concept. The wheel hit a deep, unseen pothole nestled right at the river's edge, creating a perfect, catastrophic splash. A thick, cold sheet of brown river mud erupted from the wheel, covering the entire left side of Felicia's prized Sunday muslin. The silk was ruined, her delicate bonnet spotted, her quiet peace irrevocably shattered. The carriage ground to a halt. A footman, looking suitably horrified, leapt down, but it was the figure who emerged next that silenced the entire world. Duke Jasper stood before her. 32 years old, tall and constructed with the kind of rigid, military grace that spoke of relentless discipline. He wore a coat tailored in the highest style, yet somehow still looked ready for a battlefield. His face, strikingly handsome with sharp features, was utterly cold, annoyed by the unexpected delay. He did not look at the mud on her dress. He looked at the mess. "My sincerest apologies, miss. My driver was careless. I shall pay for the garment." It was a statement, not an offer. A transaction designed to dismiss the incident instantly. Felicia felt the heat rise from her chest, a slow, burning indignation that eclipsed the sting of the cold mud. Voice low, trembling not from fear, but from the insult. "You cannot pay for the insult, Your Grace. It is not merely the muslin. It is your presumption that money can erase your reckless disruption." The Duke paused. He reached up, his long fingers instinctively touching the simple army ring he wore, a habit he used to settle his nerves. A dangerous spark entering his eye. "Then perhaps I am merely paying for your instruction, miss. You should know better than to walk near the road where powerful forces move." It was the final arrogance, the complete dismissal of her right to stand on her own ground. Stepping forward, reckless pride overcoming caution. "Indeed, Your Grace, you assume because you wear a soldier's coat and possess a title that you may command the world's quiet order. You are the most maddening man I ever laid my eyes on." The Duke stared at her, a muscle clenching in his jaw, before giving a tight, unyielding nod. He re-entered his carriage and commanded the driver onward. The silence rushed in, thick and heavy, replacing the thunder of his carriage. Felicia stared at the ruin of her new muslin. Her anger should have been pure, unadulterated fury at the expense and the humiliation. Yet an inconvenient, treacherous thought immediately intruded. A maddening man, yes, but one constructed with a staggering degree of competence. He possessed the kind of devastating handsomeness that should be reserved for figures in mythology or the heroes of Shakespeare's tragedies. It was, she knew, why the incident had left her breathless rather than simply insulted. His behavior, however, was a distinct and appalling matter. That arrogance, that cold assumption that his wealth and his discipline granted him command over her person and her circumstances. It was a profound intellectual insult. No amount of imposing beauty could excuse such a profound lapse in common decency. He was a magnificent, arrogant specimen, and the knowledge that such a mind was tethered to such overbearing pride only made him infinitely more infuriating. Felicia, too furious to notice the ruined dress any longer, only now registered the sudden emptiness of her hand. Her Shakespeare book had been knocked from her grasp and lay open, face down in the mud, ruined just like her dress. She turned to retrieve it, but the book was gone. 100 yards down the lane, Duke Jasper's carriage paused. The footman, who had been commanded to halt, quietly dismounted. He swiftly scooped up the muddy book, folded a heavy blanket over it, and remounted without a word. The Duke did not look back. He merely tightened his grip on the army ring he wore, his attention now fixed on the road ahead. The Thelwell family received an anonymous, curt note later that evening, delivered by the Duke's steward. A replacement garment will be provided without consultation by the end of the week. The note contained no apology and no mention of the book, but Felicia knew the truth. Her anger was still blazing, but a deep, unsettling suspicion had taken root. The maddening man who sought to ruin her had quietly stolen the most essential piece of her world. She would have to see the Duke again. The replacement muslin arrived precisely 3 days after the disastrous river encounter. It was of a quality far surpassing the garment the Duke's carriage had destroyed, delivered without a note, without a word of apology, and certainly without the stolen copy of Shakespeare. Felicia hated its perfection. She hated the presumption that his wealth could simply erase her righteous anger. Her mother, Lydia Thelwell, however, was ecstatic, seeing the gift as a clear sign that the Duke, powerful and unmarried, was finally taking notice of the family. "He is merely a man of honor, Mamma," Felicia told her mother later that evening, trying to steady the nerves that the very thought of Duke Jasper now caused. "He ruined my dress. He replaced it. It is nothing more than a debt settled." Lydia waved a dismissive hand, already imagining the benefits. "Nonsense, Lissy. Dukes do not concern themselves with common muslin. He is interested, and tonight at the Countess's reception you shall wear the new dress and ensure he sees precisely what a gentleman might acquire with sufficient funds." The true insult was not the mud. It was the stolen book. The gift was a paltry apology for his arrogance, but keeping her Shakespeare, that was intellectual theft. It was an admission that he knew exactly how to undermine her peace. "I must see him again, not to thank him, but to demand the return of my property. I cannot let that man possess even the smallest corner of my world." The Countess's reception was a crushing bore, thick with silk, ambition, and the cloying scent of forced conversation. Felicia, elegant but stiff in the new gown, felt the weight of her mother's expectations like lead upon her shoulders. She was seeking refuge by the library doors, discussing the true cost of the Napoleonic Wars with her youngest brother, Daniel, a topic guaranteed to repel any hopeful suitor, when Algernon Jenkins found them. Jenkins, smelling faintly of port and self-satisfaction, immediately dismissed Daniel with a patronizing chuckle. He then cornered Felicia, his gaze sweeping over the costly dress with vulgar appreciation. "You look lovely tonight, Miss Thelwell. Quite the picture of domestic virtue," he purred, leaning in. "Though I fear you still spend too much time with those ridiculous books. A woman's mind, you see, should be as tidy as her home. All that fierce wit, it is a charming youth's folly, but entirely unsuited for marriage. When you are mine, we shall burn those tedious volumes and focus on proper pursuits." Felicia felt a cold, familiar rage surge within her. This was the moment she had been dreading, where she would either swallow her dignity or destroy her family's hopes of security. She opened her mouth, ready to unleash a retort so sharp it would shame him into silence, regardless of the consequences. But she did not get the chance. A voice, cold and authoritative enough to silence the polite chatter around them, cut through the air. "With all respect, Mr. Jenkins," Duke Jasper said, stepping into the small, tight space between them. He did not look at Felicia, only at Jenkins, his gaze lethal. The value of a mind is not measured in the stitches of a tapestry. Miss Thelwell's intellect is, in my observation, remarkably sound. Far too sound to be wasted on such trivial pursuits. You would do well to remember that an army general values strategy above comfort. Jenkins spluttered, utterly dismantled by the public rebuke. The Duke, maintaining the rigid formality of a man correcting a subordinate, then turned to Felicia's mother. "Mrs. Thelwell, I require a brief word with your daughter on a matter of property boundaries. I trust you will excuse us." It was not a request. It was a military order. The Duke placed his hand firmly on the small of Felicia's back, guiding her, almost pushing her, away from the crowd and towards a secluded terrace door. His hand on her back was burning, electric, and utterly controlling. He was still radiating that maddening arrogance, assuming his intervention was universally desired. She felt rescued, yes, but also stifled. He saved my intellect only to demand control of my person. He uses his army discipline to dominate a drawing room, just as he dominates a battlefield. He is magnificent in his defense, yet utterly infuriating in his presumption. The man is a walking, breathing contradiction. Once they were safely outside on the cold stone terrace, the Duke instantly dropped his hand and turned on her, his face a study in controlled anger. "How dare you interfere, Your Grace?" Felicia hissed, pulling away from him. "I was perfectly capable of tearing him down myself. I do not need your shield to wage my own battles." "You were capable of ruining yourself, Miss Thelwell," the Duke fired back, his voice low and fierce, not wanting to be overheard. "You fight battles with the ferocity of a soldier, yet you have no foresight for the social consequences. You are utterly and completely—" He stopped himself, jaw clenching, and stared into her eyes. He was too close, his large frame blocking the cool light of the moon. "I am cursed, Miss Thelwell, to feel compelled to protect the one woman who refuses my authority. You are a beautiful disaster, and I am cursed to watch you." Felicia was trembling, caught between fury and a terrifying attraction. The Duke stood before her, breathing hard, his gaze intense. He slowly reached out, placing his finger beneath her chin, forcing her to look directly into his troubled eyes. He leaned closer, and the cold night air suddenly charged with an impossible heat. The next few days were consumed by a tense, frustrating silence. The Duke sent no further gifts, and Felicia found no opportunity to demand her book. Yet, everywhere she turned, he seemed to be there, a formidable, silent shadow at social gatherings, his presence an inescapable challenge to her hard-won independence. The inevitable confrontation occurred 3 evenings later, after a moderately successful dinner party. A sudden, unexpected late-season squall had begun, turning the gravel drive outside into a slick sheet of ice and snow. Felicia, determined to escape her mother's relentless questioning, insisted on fetching her own cloak from the carriage house. She found the Duke already there, standing near the carriages, his figure dark and imposing against the swirling white of the storm. "You are still here, Your Grace?" Felicia asked, unable to keep the challenging edge from her voice. "I presume that after your grand theatrical performance on the terrace, you would have retreated to the silence of your estate." The Duke turned, his face stern in the cold light filtering through the carriage house door. "I remain to ensure certain vulnerable parties do not meet with misadventure on the road home, Miss Thelwell. A foolish decision you seem intent on proving correct." The argument ignited instantly. Felicia threw his arrogance back in his face, citing his arrogance in believing he had jurisdiction over her movements. he retaliated, furious that she was so willfully blind to the practical danger. The shouting was muffled by the wind, but the tension was raw and immediate. "You are insufferable, Felicia." The Duke's voice was sharp, biting through the cold. "You invite peril with your reckless defiance, and yet you refuse the simplest gratitude. Your pride will ruin you. And your arrogance, Your Grace, will leave you a very lonely man," Felicia retorted, stepping closer, fueled by cold and indignation. "You believe every woman requires your military strategy to navigate a drawing room. I would rather be ruined by my own hand than saved by yours." She took an abrupt, indignant step back, slipping violently on a patch of unseen ice. The Duke, mid-sentence, stopped speaking entirely. His eyes widened in primal alarm. Damn her! Damn her stubborn, maddening spine! The Duke was furious, truly, royally incensed by her ingratitude. But the thought of her falling, of her lovely, infuriating head hitting that stone step, he could not tolerate it. He could not bear for the world to harm the only thing he had ever wanted to protect. He was a duke, a soldier, a man of cold logic, yet she had reduced him to a fool acting on instinct. He cursed under his breath. Lunging forward, he grabbed her by the waist, steadying her. Without releasing her, he roughly shrugged off his heavy army greatcoat, the same one he had worn on the day of the mud splash, and threw it over her shoulders. "You drive me to distraction, Miss Thelwell." His voice was rough, barely above a growl, his eyes fixed on hers. "You are too fragile for this battlefield you've chosen." The coat smelled of wool, gunpowder, and rain. It was enormous, heavy, and intensely warm. He was shouting at her, his fury evident in the clench of his jaw, yet his hands were steadying her, protecting her from the elements. This was not the act of a cold, arrogant man. This was the instinct of a deeply caring one, and that contradiction frightened her more than his rage ever could. How could he be so maddening, and yet, in the very same breath, offer such desperate comfort? "And you are too controlling. Release me." Felicia shivered, not just from cold, but from his sudden, overwhelming closeness and the warmth of his coat. The Duke's gaze dropped from her eyes to her lips. He pulled back, slowly releasing her waist, but his hands remained on her shoulders, holding the coat in place. He looked physically unwell, shaken by his own instinctive act. Felicia stood there, the coat heavy and warm around her, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Duke's fingers tightened slightly on the wool. Then he stepped back, leaving her utterly breathless. She knew then that the battlefield was not the drawing room or the road. It was here, between them, and the war was already lost. The very next morning, Felicia waited. She did not seek the Duke out, but she knew his habits, his sense of duty. He found her by the river path, near the spot where her dress had been ruined, a perfect neutral ground, and one that allowed her to maintain her dignity. She held the heavy army coat he had given her in her arms, treating it as an object of immense, complicated weight. The Duke approached her, his face paler than usual, his demeanor stiff and formal. "Miss Thelwell," he began, his voice flat, "I must apologize for my behavior last night. My conduct was unacceptable. I allowed my sense of propriety to eclipse my respect for your person." Felicia did not let him finish. She tossed the coat onto a nearby bench, the heavy wool falling with a soft thud. "Your Grace, I do not want your apologies, and I certainly do not want your garments. I want the truth. Why do you insist on intervening in my life? Is it simple arrogance? Is it a soldier's boredom, seeking a convenient distraction? Or is it something so profound that it frightens you?" She had moved closer, her eyes blazing with the same intellectual fire he had seen at the reception, but amplified by the intimacy of their location. She was not demanding an excuse. She was demanding honesty. The Duke knew she wanted the truth. She demanded the very thing he swore never to reveal, his duty, his sacrifice, the true financial threat to her family. He could not tell her. He could not risk her dignity or her safety. She was pushing him past his limits, demanding a surrender he could not give. He was a man of discipline, of cold logic, and yet, standing here, with her fire burning so close to his own, all he could feel was ruinous, desperate need. He had to stop her. He had to control this. In a sudden, desperate surge, the Duke lost the battle for control. He did not speak. He simply closed the distance between them, cupping her face with his large hands, and claimed her lips. It was not a gentle kiss. It was demanding, possessive, and utterly overwhelming, the kiss of a man whose discipline had broken beneath the weight of relentless desire. Felicia gasped, her hands instinctively flying to his chest, pushing against the unyielding muscle. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the Duke tore himself away. He stumbled back a step, breathing hard, his face a mask of profound, unadulterated shame. He looked at his own hands as if they were weapons he could no longer trust. He had done it. He had behaved as the very cad she accused him of being. He was a duke, sworn to uphold honor, and he had just stolen her consent in a moment of passion. He was ruined. The desire for her fire, her mind, her maddening pride, was a threat to everything he stood for. He had broken his own code. Duke Jasper, voice raw, barely a whisper. I apologize. Profoundly. He has no excuse for that kind of dishonor. Felicia stood frozen, the imprint of his lips still burning on hers. The kiss had shaken her to the core, but his immediate, raw self-condemnation, his admission of profound failure, was the truth she had been searching for. He was ashamed of his power, not proud of it. He truly regretted it. He did not see her as a prize to be won, but a person whose dignity he had accidentally violated. The fear in his eyes was real. He was terrified of his own lack of control over her. This was not the action of an arrogant man. This was the fear of a devoted one. He was so much more wounded, so much more honorable than she dared to believe. She slowly lifted her hand, touching her lips. The anger was gone, replaced by a dizzying, terrifying realization. They were no longer sparring partners. They were simply two people whose carefully constructed walls had just shattered. The argument was over. The surrender had begun. The days that followed the stolen kiss were heavy with unspoken consequence, yet strangely, they were empty of anger. The Duke, mortified by his lapse in composure, retreated entirely, sending only his regrets via his steward, an action Felicia accepted as a necessary penance, but one that left a strange, hollow ache where her fury had once resided. The formal apology had satisfied society, but it had not satisfied the dangerous intimacy that now simmered between them. Felicia knew she had to find him, not to demand another apology, but to offer absolution, which was, in itself, an act of desperate, terrifying intimacy. She found him at his estate library late one afternoon, ostensibly reviewing documents, though his gaze was clearly fixed on nothing but misery. He rose instantly when she entered, his posture rigid. Miss Thelwell, the Duke stated. He presumed she would not wish to be subjected to his presence again. Your presumption is, as ever, a great offense, Felicia replied, her voice soft but steady. I came because I did not want your last memory of me to be a scene of mutual distress. I came to see the true cost of your intervention. She moved past the formality, going straight to the core of his anguish. She saw the heavy army ring he always wore, and the quiet loneliness that clung to him even in the luxury of his library. He would not be softened by demands for love or commitment. He would only be softened by the recognition of his pain. You left the army for a reason, Your Grace. It was not merely to inherit this title. There is a cost you carry. If you expect me to understand your ceaseless need to interfere, you must tell me what it is you are truly protecting yourself from, Felicia challenged. The challenge was delivered not with anger, but with profound compassion. The Duke stared at her, his formidable defenses trembling. He moved to a small cabinet and retrieved a simple, tarnished silver locket. He opened it, revealing the faint portrait of a young man, similar to him, but smiling. My younger brother, lost in the war. I was his commanding officer. I failed to protect him. I carry that failure, Miss Thelwell. Every time I see you act with such glorious, reckless defiance, I see the fate I could not avert. I'm not trying to command your mind. I'm trying to control the uncontrollable, Duke Jasper confessed, his voice a low, rough grate. He had never intended to tell her, but facing her quiet, discerning eyes, he felt the heavy burden of his history lift slightly. She was looking at him not with pity, but with a terrible, tender understanding. He had always believed his past made him unworthy of peace, yet she seemed to suggest that his wound made him worthy of her. Felicia moved forward, closing the distance, and gently placed her hand on his, the hand that held the locket. You are trying to save the world, Your Grace. You cannot save the world. You can only save yourself, and perhaps the person standing right in front of you, Felicia stated. The locket fell from his hand, the small, fragile portrait forgotten. All the discipline, all the formality, all the maddening pride finally shattered. The barrier was gone. He looked at her, not as the haughty duke, but as the wounded man she had finally exposed. She saw the raw, desperate need in his eyes, stripped of arrogance. She knew what this moment meant. It was not a reckless kiss born of anger, but a profound, mutual acceptance of their flaws. There was no going back. The rules of society, her mother's desperate ambitions, the threat of Algernon Jenkins, none of it mattered. This was the moment where courage overcame fear, and two souls, equally burdened, chose honesty over honor. She understood the cost, and she knew she would pay it. He reached for her, his touch reverent, not commanding. This kiss was slow, careful, and final, a silent vow of mutual surrender. The hours that followed were spent in the quiet, absolute sanctuary of his library, a place meant for knowledge, now sanctified by vulnerability. They shared the truth of their burdens, the passion of their collision, and the silence of a love that had been desperately fighting to exist. Felicia, resting against the wide expanse of the Duke's chest, understood with a terrifying clarity that this was not merely a conquest of passion, but the deepest emotional truth she had ever encountered. The man who had been so maddeningly disciplined was, in fact, boundless in his capacity for feeling. His zeal, which she had fought so fiercely, was now directed entirely toward her, a profound and focused devotion that settled the chaos in her own heart. She spoke softly of her anxieties, her fear of Algernon Jenkins, the shame of her family's debts, and her fierce determination to control her own fate. He listened, not with judgment, but with the quiet intensity of a commander internalizing essential intelligence. The Duke, for his part, spoke of the loneliness of duty, of the crushing weight of his title, and the terror that had consumed him when his own younger brother was lost. He confessed that his initial attraction to her had been pure annoyance, a desire to correct the anomaly she represented in his ordered world. That annoyance had quickly transmuted into a powerful, frightening obsession, a primal need to keep her safe, even if it meant alienating her. The admission cost him dearly, but every word solidified the foundation of their bond. They were, in that moment, two equals, a duke stripped of his rank and a woman stripped of her pride. As the grey light of dawn began to touch the window panes, the Duke held Felicia close, his face buried in her hair. She felt his breathing steady. She felt his protective, honest love. The world outside, the world of gossip and expectation, seemed impossibly distant. The thought of returning to her mother's house, to the suffocating presence of Algernon Jenkins and the endless social maneuvering, felt unbearable. She belonged here, in the quiet strength of his arms. The price of this honesty, however, would be severe. Their secret, born of such intense truth, would be judged as simple scandal by society. The Duke shifted, his hands tightening around her, and he spoke a line that chilled her to the core, pulling her abruptly back to the reality of their dangerous world. "I must leave, Felicia. I have one final duty I cannot escape. I must protect your family from the outside." The Duke was gone before the rising sun could touch the library floor. The cold air, the lingering scent of rain and gunpowder, and the silence were all that remained of his presence. Felicia stood alone, the memory of his solemn, sacrificial kiss burning on her lips. She ran to the desk, finding no note, no scrap of paper that proved his love. He had truly burned his private promise, leaving her with nothing but the terrible memory of his honest devotion. But 3 days later, a letter arrived, bearing the seal of the Duke's steward and a cryptic postmark from Edinburgh, Scotland. Felicia tore the wax seal, her heart hammering against the simple army ring she now carried in her pocket. The letter was formal in its address, referencing the necessary affairs of state, but the words held a palpable, urgent emotion that belied the neat script. "Miss Thelwell, my duty requires this absence, which I confess is executed with a military bluntness I deeply regret. I write to inform you that I have safely arrived at this distant post to secure matters which bear directly upon the well-being of your future. I pray you retain your patience with me. I find I cannot amend the past, but I will ensure your future is secure. Please inform me, without delay, of the state of your health. Are you taking suitable meals? Does the cold affect your sleep? I trust you will protect your strength, for mine is currently failing me. Know that I contemplate no decision, nor conduct any business, without measuring its effect upon your peace." Felicia read the letter twice, her tears blurring the elegant script. He had used the language of direct, desperate concern, sleep, health, meals, to ask her if she was broken, if she was safe, and if she was still thinking of him. The vulnerability was immediate and profound. Felicia immediately replied. She did not mention her confusion, nor did she speak of the mortgages. She simply told him of her tedious mother, the arrogant visits of Algernon Jenkins, and assured him that her health was fine, but her solitude was difficult. Over the next 2 months, a profound, passionate correspondence deepened their bond far beyond the superficial intimacy of their night together. The Duke wrote of the crushing weight of diplomatic duty, and she wrote of the quiet beauty of the river path. He consistently asked if she was eating properly, if the weight of society was too great, and reiterated his deepest sorrow for his conduct at the start of their acquaintance. The Duke's devotion was proving boundless, shielded by the appropriate use of "your humble servant" and "duty requires." He was, through these letters, revealing a soul consumed by her welfare. Then, 6 weeks into the correspondence, approximately 3 months after his departure, the first wave of nausea struck. Not grief, but sickness. A terrible, dizzying clarity swept over Felicia. She ran to her mirror, examining the subtle changes in her body, noticing the exhaustion that was not related to social fatigue. She touched her flat stomach, her hand trembling. It had been 6 weeks since the start of the correspondence, confirming her terrifying suspicion. She was carrying his child. Felicia immediately withdrew, using the excuse of a severe country cough to avoid all society. She could not write the news in the formal, measured voice he required. She spent a week in agonizing contemplation, knowing this news would utterly destroy his peace. She wrote the letter simply, honestly, and without any demands. "Your Grace, I thank you for your continued regard. I confess that the sun does not shine here, and my health is more precarious than I previously admitted. You spoke of the depth of your regret regarding the start of our acquaintance. Know that I am now carrying the permanent consequence of that beginning. I am with child. I await your decision, whatever it may be." She sent the letter immediately, knowing the courier would take 2 weeks to reach Edinburgh. Her heart broke for the man she knew would receive it. Felicia endured 3 more agonizing weeks. The Duke's next letter was not in the mail. Instead, a frantic, unprecedented summons arrived from the Thelwell estate's butler, stating that an exhausted, disheveled Duke Jasper had just ridden into the estate, demanding to see Miss Thelwell immediately. He had returned 4 months after leaving, 2 months earlier than planned. The moment the estate butler delivered the frantic summons, all of Felicia's carefully constructed dignity nearly failed her. Duke Jasper had returned 4 months after leaving, 2 months early, a clear sign that her letter had struck him with the force of a cannonball. He had solved his complex mission faster than anticipated, abandoning his planned honorable return to address the devastating news she had delivered. Felicia did not rush. She took a moment to ensure her gown was perfectly straight, smoothing the muslin over her body, which was now carrying the unmistakable fullness of a 4-month pregnancy. She deliberately pulled the army ring from her pocket and clutched the heavy silver band firmly in her palm. She would meet him with her dignity intact, forcing him to confront the truth of his actions, not her despair. She walked into the library, where the butler indicated he was waiting. The scene was shocking. The Duke, usually the epitome of order and impeccable grooming, was utterly disheveled. His coat was covered in dust from a hard ride, his face drawn with sleepless travel, and his striking light blue eyes were wide with a desperate, terrible sorrow. He looked at her not as a beautiful woman, but as a casualty of his own flawed honor. "Felicia," the Duke whispered, his voice so raw it was barely recognizable. He did not move toward her. His hands remained clenched at his sides. "Your Grace," Felicia replied, her voice calm and steady. "I received your summons. You returned sooner than anticipated. Was your mission in Edinburgh not successful?" Her control shattered his composure entirely. He flinched, staring at the visible reality of her condition, the beautiful, vulnerable swell that her careful dress could no longer completely hide. The Duke was utterly undone. His 4 months of self-imposed exile, his rigorous adherence to duty, his burning of the promise, all of it had been for nothing. He had tried to protect her dignity by sacrificing his love, and instead, his love had created the very ruin he sought to prevent. The guilt was a physical agony, tearing through the defenses he had meticulously rebuilt during his mission. The mission in Edinburgh had been swift and devastatingly successful. He had dismantled Algernon Jenkins' debt structure and quietly secured her father's mortgages, preparing to return honorably. But then, her letter arrived, and the entire landscape of his duty dissolved into dust. "Successful?" the Duke repeated, the word bitter in his mouth. "The financial matter is settled. Jenkins is neutered, but I have failed, Felicia. I have failed you in the most profound way a man may fail a woman." He finally moved, but not to embrace her. He moved to the nearest chair, collapsing onto it, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders began to tremble violently. The powerful Duke Jasper, the man of discipline, strategy, and unrelenting control, was sobbing, entirely undone by the dishonor he felt he had brought upon her. Felicia stood transfixed. This was not the arrogant madman who had forced a kiss upon her, nor was it the stoic soldier who wrote yearning letters. This was the deeply wounded man, utterly broken by the consequences of his own impulsive passion. He was not crying for the scandal. He was not crying for the ruined honor. He was crying for the pain he had caused her. He was terrified of the scrutiny she now faced because of his failure to control his emotions that night. Felicia slowly walked over to him, her heart aching with a deep, maternal tenderness that eclipsed her earlier resentment. She knelt beside the chair, clutching the army ring firmly in her palm. She gently reached out and stroked the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his disheveled hair. "Duke Jasper," Felicia murmured, her voice firm with tenderness. "Look at me." He slowly raised his head, his striking blue eyes bloodshot and raw with tears. I've heard the gossip, Your Grace. I know what the ton is saying, that I have been abandoned, that my position is ruined. But you did not ruin me. Your presence here, now, is the only proof that matters. The scandal, the Duke whispered, his voice catching on a sob. The child. It is my fault. I acted on emotion, and I did not protect your future. I cursed you with my desire. You did not curse me, Felicia corrected him gently, stroking his cheek. You loved me, and now you are here. We have a child, and we have the truth. Do not blame yourself for what was beautiful and inevitable. We are partners in this, not victims of it. She gently pulled his head down, resting it against her shoulder, allowing him to weep fully into the silk of her dress. The Duke clung to her, the sheer relief and the agony of his guilt washing over him. The powerful man had broken down completely in the arms of the woman he had tried so hard to protect. He was her soldier, stripped of his armor, finding comfort only in her strength. I will claim you, the Duke vowed, his voice muffled against her gown. I will shield you from every whisper. I will marry you immediately today if possible. I swear you will never suffer for my failure. Felicia held him tightly. The maddening man had finally become her greatest comfort. The emotional reckoning in the library had lasted only minutes, but it had irrevocably changed the landscape of their lives. The Duke, renewed by Felicia's forgiveness and her quiet, fierce strength, pulled back from her, his face still streaked with shame, but his eyes now burning with focused resolve. He was no longer the guilty man. He was the protective commander. We have no time for tenderness, my love, Duke Jasper stated, rising swiftly. We must secure your honor before the gossip catches fire. Where is your mother? Felicia, recovering her own composure, smoothed her dress. She is likely attempting to coax another visit from Algernon Jenkins. He is currently unaware of his financial ruin. Excellent, the Duke replied, a sharp, dangerous quality returning to his voice. Then he shall witness his complete and final defeat. The Duke did not wait for his carriage. He placed his heavy army greatcoat over Felicia's shoulders, the familiar gesture now carrying the weight of permanent ownership, and escorted her quickly to her family's drawing room. The scene was precisely as Felicia had described. Lydia Thelwell was holding court near the fireplace, attempting a conversation of calculated intimacy with Algernon Jenkins, who was preening under her attention. The entrance of the Duke, still disheveled from travel and gripping Felicia's hand with fierce intensity, brought the room to a horrified silence. Your Grace, what an unexpected, marvelous surprise! Lydia Thelwell gasped, her social instincts immediately overriding her shock at his unannounced return. You have returned just in time to hear Mr. Jenkins's excellent news regarding— Silence, Mrs. Thelwell, the Duke commanded, his voice cutting through the air with a volume and authority that silenced the very walls. He ignored the woman entirely, focusing his lethal attention on Jenkins, who was scrambling to rise. Mr. Jenkins, I believe you have overstayed your welcome, the Duke stated, his voice quiet, deadly, a terrible sound of restrained power. Jenkins, smelling faintly of port and self-satisfaction, attempted to rally. I assure you, Your Grace, I was merely discussing matters of marriage, a proposal of the greatest generosity. Miss Thelwell's honor demands I protect her from— The Duke interrupted him, his patience annihilated by the sheer audacity of the rival. Her honor is not in question, Jenkins, nor is her person in need of your meager protection. The Duke stepped forward, pulling Felicia slightly in front of him, drawing attention to her figure, which, at 4 months, was still discreet but visible to a trained eye. He then faced the room, raising his voice so it resonated with the full force of his title. Mrs. Thelwell, Mr. Jenkins, I have returned to announce my engagement. Miss Thelwell and I have been privately contracted for some time. I'm here now to claim my bride, and to ensure that no further impertinence regarding her hand is tolerated in my absence. Felicia felt the collective shock of the room hit her like a wave, but she stood firm, clutching the ring in her hand. Lydia Thelwell staggered backward, clutching her chest. Her face was a glorious spectrum of shock, relief, and social terror. Contracted. "But, my dear Duke, this is terribly irregular. We must have time for the announcements and the—" She trailed off, realizing her daughter was marrying the highest-ranking man in the room. Her terror of scandal was immediately replaced by the ambition of becoming the mother of a duchess. Algernon Jenkins was not so easily defeated. He rose, pale with indignation and desperation. "Contracted. This is an outrage. I demand satisfaction. You are compromising her reputation, Your Grace. She has been seen constantly in company with me. Her reputation is now mine to defend," the Duke thundered, his control finally slipping. He moved toward Jenkins, his towering military frame filling the space with menace. "And you, sir, are in no position to speak of honor. Your debts are now called. I suggest you retire to your solicitor immediately, unless you wish to spend the afternoon in debtor's prison. You will never approach Miss Thelwell again." The threat was clear, backed by the implicit knowledge that the Duke had secured the means to execute it. Jenkins, utterly dismantled, fled the room without another word, his ambition crushed by the Duke's financial and social authority. The Duke turned back to Felicia, his fury dissolving into protective tenderness. "Felicia," the Duke said, his voice softening, but his words remaining a command designed to secure her dignity. "We shall be married quietly, by special license, immediately. I refuse to subject you to another day of this absurdity." He then addressed Lydia Thelwell, who was still speechless. "Mrs. Thelwell, I've already secured the legal documentation. The wedding will take place tomorrow at dawn. I require only your consent to her hand and the presence of a witness. I shall send a carriage for Miss Thelwell tonight. There is no time for further discussion." Lydia, completely overwhelmed by the reality of a duke securing the family's solvency and her daughter's title in one fell swoop, simply nodded weakly. The Duke turned to Felicia, leaning down close to her ear. "We will be married tomorrow. I do not care if the child is born in 2 months or 4 months. The exact time is immaterial as long as I can make you my wife and shield you. Society will adhere to the fiction we provide." He kissed her forehead, a proprietary, final kiss, before walking quickly out the door to secure the license. Felicia stood alone in the drawing room, the scent of the Duke's masculine urgency replacing the faint port of Jenkins. She was not leaving as a bankrupt spinster. She was leaving as a pregnant duchess, claimed by the most maddeningly devoted man in England. The carriage ride from the Thelwell estate to the Duke's private London residence was conducted in utter silence. Felicia sat cloaked in the Duke's greatcoat, clutching his army ring, watching the lights of the city blur. She was now under his protection, married tomorrow at dawn, but the silence felt heavy with the weight of unsaid truths. She understood his mission was complete, that Algernon Jenkins was neutralized, and that her family's financial ruin was averted by his hand. Yet she needed to know that the man who had brought her to this precipice was capable of being her partner, not merely her protector. The time for command was over. The time for confession was now. Upon arriving at the Duke's house, they did not retire. Instead, the Duke led her into a small, quiet study, a sanctuary dedicated to contemplation and difficult counsel. A fire was roaring fiercely in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering light upon the leather-bound volumes and chasing away the autumn chill. He poured 2 glasses of brandy, though Felicia merely held hers for warmth. His movements were precise, controlled, a shield against the torrent of emotion he had already unleashed in the library. "I require your absolute honesty now, Felicia," Duke Jasper stated, his voice low and firm, standing before the fire, once again the commander of their small world. "My duty is complete. I have secured your marriage, your honor, and your future. Now I must earn your worth." He looked at her, and the sternness melted into vulnerability. You asked me in your letter if I regretted the beginning of our acquaintance. I told you I did, but I must be clearer. I regret my lack of control. I regret that my arrogance created the circumstance that forces your hand now. I will not pretend that I did not hear the gossip regarding my abandonment. You believed me faithless. You believed I had seduced you and fled, leaving you to face the ruin I had sworn to prevent. Tell me now that this is true. It was true, Felicia confessed, her voice firm but laced with the memory of pain. And it was the worst agony of the past 4 months. Your letters were my only solace, but your silence regarding the future was cruel. You expected me to trust your silence while I endured the shame of your absence and the fear of what my condition would mean for my family. You chose to be a solitary soldier when I needed a partner. The Duke walked over to her, his immense frame folding down until he was kneeling before her chair, looking up at her with profound remorse. He placed his large, scarred hands gently over her pregnant stomach, resting them just below the point where she clutched the army ring. I deserve your cruelty, the Duke whispered, his voice catching with the remaining roughness of his breakdown. I should have risked compromising my mission by sending you a clear vow of my intent, but the failure I carried, the loss of my brother, blinded me. I believed if I controlled every factor, I could avert tragedy. I chose duty over trust, and in doing so, I committed the greatest dishonor against you. I thought I was protecting your virtue. Instead, I shattered your peace. He finally stood, pulling her gently up into his arms, but not forcing intimacy. He simply held her against his chest, allowing her to feel the strong, steady rhythm of his heart. Duke Jasper, I will spend the remainder of my life earning your worth, Felicia. I will never keep counsel from you again. I promise you a marriage of absolute truth and partnership. Tell me now, before the sun rises and the vows are said, do you forgive the maddening man for the chaos he created? Felicia leaned back, looking into his eyes. She saw the full scope of his vulnerability, the protective, complicated man who had confessed his guilt and offered her not just his title, but his absolute truth. He was no longer just the maddening man. He was her safe harbor. I forgive the man who burned his love to save my honor, Felicia whispered, reaching up and placing her hand over his cheek. And I accept the man who returned, broken, to claim our child. A slow smile, utterly devoid of his usual arrogance, touched the Duke's lips. He reached up, gently brushing a strand of auburn hair from her cheek. His striking light blue eyes softened with a look of such utter, unguarded adoration that it made Felicia's breath hitch. A low, intimate whisper, a slight smile touching his lips. You may call me infuriating, my love, but you cannot call me broken. Not when I have you to make me whole. Felicia felt the rush of heat to her cheeks and dropped her gaze. He gently lifted her chin with his thumb, demanding her gaze. Look at me, my lady. I want to see if you truly love this maddening man who has created such chaos. A genuine, spontaneous laugh escaped Felicia, the first unburdened sound he had heard from her since his return. I was entirely prepared to ruin myself, Your Grace, Felicia chuckled. He gave a rich, masculine chuckle, his light blue eyes crinkling at the corners. Indeed. I recall that evening, you and Mr. Jenkins, so preoccupied with your verbal sparring. From my vantage point, you both resembled nothing so much as little ants scuttling about a discarded sugar cube. The intimacy of him sharing that arrogant internal thought bound them completely. The Duke pulled her close, and this final kiss was a tender, solemn promise, a sealing of their marriage before the public vows were ever spoken. I have one last confession, the Duke admitted, pulling the heavy army ring from his pocket. The book, your Shakespeare. I did not leave it in the mud, Felicia. I have carried it with me everywhere I have traveled. It is here, now, in the cabinet behind you. I wanted to return it when I could give you everything, including my complete honesty. Felicia's breath caught. He had kept her heart, symbolized by the book, safe through his entire ordeal. She reached back, opening the cabinet, and found the water-stained, beloved volume. They stood there, two souls finally unified by truth, ready to face the world and the dawn. The wedding took place at dawn, as promised, in the small stone chapel adjoining the Duke's London residence. It was a cold, grey morning, but the interior of the chapel was warm, lit only by dozens of beeswax candles that cast a soft, golden glow upon the altar. There were no guests save Felicia Thelwell, who alternated between silent tears of social relief and furious whispers about the lack of suitable flowers, and Daniel, Felicia's brother, who served as a quiet, proud witness. Felicia wore a simple cream gown purchased hastily the day before. It was not a suitable ducal wedding dress, but its simple lines draped gently over the fullness of her 4-month pregnancy, cloaking her shame while celebrating her impending motherhood. She wore no jewels, only the simple gold band that was about to be placed on her finger and the Duke's army ring which she kept clutched firmly in her palm. The Duke waited for her by the altar. He was no longer disheveled. He was immaculate in his formal morning attire, yet his face was lined with the exhaustion of the previous night's emotional reckoning and the furious haste of the morning. His striking light blue eyes were fixed solely on her. When she reached him, the priest began the ceremony immediately. The Duke did not recite the traditional formal vows. When asked to speak, his voice was raw, breaking slightly with the emotion he had held back for so long. "Felicia, I take you as my Duchess, as my partner, and as the mother of my child." Felicia felt the tears finally spill down her cheeks, not tears of fear, but of profound, warm relief. The Duke held her gaze, defying every rule of social propriety. He would not stand before God and lie about the consequence of their love. He had promised Felicia a marriage of absolute truth, and this, his final public breach of honor, was his ultimate vow. He had used his power to silence the tongue. He would now use it to sanctify their child. Duke Jasper continued, "I cannot promise you a life free of complication, for my own pride has ensured that. But I promise you a marriage of absolute truth. I promise you that my heart, my mind, and my immense resources are yours to command. I will spend the remainder of my life seeking your forgiveness for the pain my arrogance caused, and I will forever cherish the strength you have shown me. You are my safe harbor, and I vow to honor you above all duty." When it was her turn, she did not look at the priest or her mother. She looked only at the man who had laid his soul bare for her. "Duke Jasper, I accept the shame that society will place upon us, for I know it is rooted in the depth of our love. You have shown me that your powerful hands are capable of both war and tenderness. I take you as my husband, and I vow to share your burdens, your counsel, and your dreams. I accept your immense love, and I promise you that you never have to be alone in your duty again. I will be your strength and your comfort, for as long as we both shall live." The Duke could not speak another word. He simply slid the wedding ring onto her finger, his hand trembling slightly, and the promise was sealed. After the short ceremony, the priest blessed them, and the Duke immediately turned to Felicia, pulling her into a tight embrace that had nothing to do with society and everything to do with ownership and desperate devotion. He buried his face in her hair, gripping her as if he feared she might dissolve. He finally pulled back, resting his hand gently, protectively on the small swell of her stomach. "You are mine, Duchess, now and forever." He escorted her immediately to their awaiting, newly prepared carriage. They left the estate and the city entirely, choosing to retreat to the quiet sanctuary of the Duke's most private country estate, a remote, secure haven where the whispers of the Tun could not reach them. As the carriage pulled away, leaving the chaos and the constraints of London behind, Felicia leaned her head on the Duke's shoulder. She knew their journey had been chaotic, frustrating, and often heartbreaking, but the raw, honest love that had been forged in defiance and confession was unbreakable. The maddening man was finally hers, and his immense, devoted heart was now her eternal comfort.